Director at Future Water Institute, University of Cape Town, South Africa. And with her, we have Dr. Lloyd Fisher, who is Water Resource Engineer at Cape Town, South Africa. And both of them are here to share their wonderful experience regarding benchmarking of water-sensitive cities, case of Cape Town. So I'll just hand it over to Dr. Kirsty. Thank you.
Thanks, Shivali. Hello, everybody, again. Just to explain to you that what we're trying to do with the webinars today and tomorrow is to pique your interest a little bit in some of the work that's actually happening on the ground in South Africa around the implementation of water-sensitive design and planning. It's just two examples, and obviously the background to a lot of what you're going to hear today and tomorrow will come through in the actual training itself. So it may not be that you get the entire that you understand all that we're trying to tell you, or that you see what the end goal is of these experiences that we're showing you, but it will give you a taste of what's happening out in the field. And the one today, Lloyd is an ex-colleague of mine from UCT. He did his PhD at UCT and was instrumental in the development of the framework and guidelines for water-sensitive design in South Africa. And he's now working for Oricon Zutari. Has it been changed yet, Lloyd? I'm not sure, but
it changed soon.
Okay. It's a consulting firm in Cape Town, well, in South Africa. And we've been working together on a collaborative project that was conceptualized in 2018, actually, at the tail end of the Day Zero crisis in Cape Town. And as the Western Cape province and the city were grappling with new ways of thinking around water management and to ensure good water governance. So there was an acknowledgement at that time, borne out in the recent Cape Town water strategy, and I'm sure Lloyd will talk about that, that a water-sensitive approach was needed. So what happened was that we put a proposal together to province, to the Western Cape province, for working together with the Cooperative Research Centre for Water-Sensitive Cities at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia, using their Water-Sensitive Cities Index to start thinking about how we could benchmark the progress and transition towards a water-sensitive city for the city of Cape Town, and ultimately, hopefully, using these lessons to take this process further into South Africa as a whole. So Lloyd will give an overview of the project and the water-sensitive index process, and we can then hopefully have a bit of time to discuss this at the end of his presentation. So Lloyd, are you happy to share your screen?
Yeah, I just stopped sharing.
Okay, thanks, Dhruv.
Cool. Cool. Are you saying is it full screen?
Yeah, we are. Thank you.
Okay. Perfect. Thanks, Kirsty. As Kirsty mentioned, I'm going to be talking about a project called Benchmarking and Implementation Strategy for the Transition towards a water-sensitive Cape Town. I'm Lloyd Fisher-Jeffes from Oricon at the moment, and next week this time we will be called Zutari. The contents of the presentation is just a bit on the project team, why now, the method of this project, and then the project aims and any questions and discussion towards the end. A bit about the project, and I think it's an important factor, is that it's co-funded or sponsored by the City of Cape Town and Western Cape government. So while we're benchmarking the City of Cape Town, we're using it as a opportunity to develop or further develop the benchmarking process for the South African context. So the benchmarking process we're using has been largely developed in Australia, with one or two exceptions, and it's great from a water-sensitive cities perspective, but it does need to be contextualized and account for the challenges and differences in how South Africa is to places like Australia. So this collaboration is great because it's not only Cape Town, but will hopefully roll out wider to the Western Cape and maybe the rest of South Africa. The project team is also is a diverse group. So we've got probably a 50-50 split between academia and industry, which is quite nice and a good example of trying to bridge both academia and industry and in order to bring water-sensitive cities and water-sensitive design and practice to life. We also have quite a diverse team in terms of experience, from graphic designers to climate specialists, environmental sciences. So a project like this does require quite a diverse team. And I think that's something that's quite nice and something that we've been able to leverage by bringing both industry and academia together on this project. We've also, as part of it, there was a call to try and spread this further. So we do have some academic work experience. So trying to bridge that gap further at the study level. So master's and PhD students that are working on the project, but bridging that gap in themselves. So they work 25% of their time in industry and 75% on their project. And all of that is giving some interesting insights as we develop and implement this project. So I'm sure if you haven't discussed it yet, you'll discuss it a lot more of the coming sessions. But a water-sensitive city is essentially cities that are sustainable, resilient, productive, livable through a combination of both physical infrastructure, governance arrangements, and social engagement. So that doesn't mean just looking at things like water recycling and water conservation, demand management, but it means bringing in amenity, biodiversity, equity in the provision of services. And all of this is great in theory, and you can progress towards it. But how do you know how fast you're progressing, and how do you know what the next step is that you need to do? So this process looks at trying to first benchmark where you are so you can measure your progress, but also identify where you need to work on in order to speed up your transition to a water-sensitive city. There's further context, and this is relatively important. When we get to the implementation phase, you'll see probably why, but the Western Cape government has in policy committed and made a statement of intent to bringing and adopting water-sensitive urban design planning principles into how water is managed in the province. It's also supported in the principles that are embedded in the National Water and Sanitation Master Plan. So there's good institutional and governance support for it, for these principles to be brought into planning. There's also a long history, and again, this will become more apparent in the implementation phase why it's important, but a lot of work through the WRC, South Africa's Water Research Commission, and UCT, starting in 2013, 2014, 15, and since then through the community of practice has led to this point. Without these projects, it probably wouldn't be possible to be trying to benchmark a city at this point. You need this base knowledge and champions to be out there. And then Kirsty touched on why now. And part of that is the recent drought made everyone a lot more aware in Cape Town with the threats of day zero and severe water restrictions. All of that brought it to the fore that we needed to do something differently, that Cape Town is largely served by large surface water dams, and maybe that's not the most resilient approach that we could take going forward. So there was this recognition that something probably needed to change, and the city adopted the 5 commitments. 4 of them talk to many of the principles in a water-sensitive city in terms of safe and equitable access, water-wise use. But the 5th commitment is specifically to achieving a water-sensitive city by 2040, which is a very bold commitment, and hopefully they will achieve it. But it's a good commitment to make and work towards. So in that vein, this project aims to promote that transition for the city of Cape Town, but also the cities and towns in the Western Cape, and supported by the Western Cape government and the project team. to facilitate collaboration between Western Cape and the City of Cape Town, adopting best practice in benchmarking. So one of the things is, which we'll discuss just now, is why we selected this benchmarking tool and maybe didn't develop a completely new one, was specifically because we wanted to do best practice and be able to compare to cities around the world. But with that said, we do need to contextualize it to South Africa and then develop an implementation guide that supports cities and towns begin this transition in the Western Cape, and then communicate the outcomes. So I mean, it's quite important that a benchmarking and transitions framework or process isn't considered to be the process through which you achieve a water sensitive city immediately. You don't just benchmark and then get it. It develops the implementation strategy, which calls on a lot of other factors that need to come in to achieve that, but it sets you up to transitioning towards being water sensitive. Lots of cities around the world have various resilience projects going on. I think in Cape Town at the moment, there are about 6 parallel projects looking at various aspects of resilience, water governance. This project aims to pull those together and help them to all talk towards achieving a water sensitive city. And then, you know, it's often said, well, we know what we need to do. We talk about it a lot. We need to start harvesting stormwater. We must reuse water. Many of those examples. But the point is, it's great to talk about it, but we need to be able to measure where we are and coordinate how we move forward. It's no point having little bits here and there, and then it's not supported. And I think this comes out quite a bit in the implementation phase. So our project methodology, we go through an inception phase, we go through a benchmarking is our phase 2, then we develop a vision and implementation strategy for the city, and then we roll that out. And through each of these phases, there's a series of workshops and reports, which is very stakeholder driven, with a lot of background quantitative work that then is used qualitatively to guide discussions and assess where the City of Cape Town is. So the first phase, and I've lost my, is planning workshops, is a planning workshop. It's standard project stuff, Inception, and identifying stakeholders, which is a key thing, because you can get stakeholders with special interests and then you guide your strategy off in one direction, or to get a nice representative sample of stakeholders, both in age and gender, backgrounds, incomes, all of that needs to be considered as part of your stakeholder identification and inception phase. We then go through three workshops, first beginning with benchmarking, then we vision, and then we plan that transition. The benchmarking phase starts with a systems analysis, where we look at the City of Cape Town at a table, a desktop study, and review the water systems, where water comes from, how it's used, volumes of how much individuals use in the city between different areas, do a proper desktop study of how water is used in the city. We then run a series of a workshop where we benchmark using specific indicators that talk to a water sensitive city in terms of, is it a water supply, is there adequate sanitation, drainage, is it considered a waterway city, water sensitive, and all these factors, including whether there's resilience, livability, sustainability, productivity, or if you use the practices, things like, is it a city as a catchment, or providing ecological services. So we do that through looking at 34 evidence-based indicators, and these are workshopped where you everyone rates it based on a rating scale of 1 to 5, and then there's an opportunity to contest how different people have rated it and come to a conclusion. So you can't just rate it, well, I feel like my area is pretty well serviced, so cool, it's a fully serviced area. someone else can come with evidence that, well, there's no services in this part of the city and that affects 20% of the city. So you can't, and then there's a whole back and forth discussion, which then leads to hopefully a consensus. And that results in the benchmarking. Once we get to, these are some of the results you'll see. So you'll see it in terms of the city states, from water supply through to water sensitive. And in South Africa, we would hope everyone would be sitting at a drained city, much like Australia. But I think in South Africa, we know there's some challenges with sanitation provision and water supply. And then you can look at each indicator that makes that up in a bit more detail and see where you are compared to another city, what they're doing well, what you're doing well. And that's one of the advantages of trying to fine-tune this tool to South Africa or contextualize it, is that we can see on the same indicators how we're comparing with cities in Australia and elsewhere in the world. The other nice thing is, and it's a more recent development on this benchmarking process, is that the water sensitive city links into all the SDGs at different levels. And as we know, it's not surprising with water being so central to everything. But in delivering a water sensitive city in a developing country context, you're also addressing your sustainable development goals. And it's just a further support for why we should be doing this in a developing country context and not be ignoring it to something that's coming from Australia, where they have all the resources or funding to do a lot of this stuff. So it's actually core to achieving some of those SDGs. But as I've mentioned, there is a need for contextualizing it to South Africa. And in that vein, we're going back a bit to our framework for South Africa, water sensitive design framework for South Africa, and looking at the almost a history of two cities in one, and that we want to bring that together. So I think many of the South Africans on the call would recognize that we have a lot of formal areas which are generally well serviced. They've got water supply, sanitation, to the house, pretty much good drainage, flood protection, and that's great. But there's a large portion of the population that doesn't, due to our apartheid history and how that resulted in planning and development, that are informal areas which have challenges with drainage, sanitation. And that for this to move forward, we need to try and account for that in our benchmarking. So there's no point in benchmarking, say, a city and saying, well, 80% of the population are fully serviced, so that's fine, or we average it out on the numbers, and you potentially lose the impact on the livelihoods of those in the informal areas. So we're coming back here and trying to work out, well, maybe we should benchmark these areas separately and then consolidate it into a single score, and in that way we can see in implementation what the differences are and where we need to put our focus on trying to bring these two cities forward to one and achieve a water sensitive city in the future. So as part of that, and I won't go through all the indicators, but these are the 34 indicators in their 7 groups. And we've identified or pulled out which ones are applicable to the city as a whole. So things like knowledge, skills, and organizational capacity, well, that's embedded in your city staff and can be rated as a whole. But things like public engagement, participation, and transparency, well, it's possibly quite different in a formal area and an informal area. Or your equitable access to safe water is certainly different in a formal and informal area. Formal areas, like where I stay, we all have water plumbed into our houses, whereas an informal area, it might be a communal tap. And that definitely impacts your relationship with water and how you experience it. And so we're splitting out those two and going to benchmark the City of Cape Town in 2, looking at formal, although there's great diversification with informal and communities and all of that, but try and at least at a high level split it into 2 different areas and try and understand what's going on differently and as a city as a whole, so we don't lose that resolution or the impacts on people's livelihoods. the process does go through an accreditation, and I think it's something worth mentioning, why the accreditation is important, and that's so that we can compare with other cities. So it's a cheap and it's easy to do, but it's an important part of this benchmarking process is that you need to be accredited, which really means that you know the background theory, you know what the indicators mean, and you know how it's meant to be facilitated so that you don't guide the answers that you get from your participants. You let them give you the answers, but you ensure that you get the debate going without directing it. So there's a bit of training. And it helps, and then it also means that it can get taken back to the CRC, which does this benchmarking with all the other cities, and you can compare your city with others. Whereas if we develop a new benchmarking tool completely, you lose that ability. We then would move on to phase 3, which is the vision and implementation, and it's another workshop where we sit down with stakeholders and guide them and pull out what they see as a water-sensitive city, which might be quite different in Cape Town to Joburg to Sydney or Melbourne. So your solutions might also be slightly different. What might be considered water-sensitive in Australia might have a lot of green. There might be one or two areas where some hard grey infrastructure might help in terms of managing water quality from an informal settlement that's not fully serviced. And those sorts of things need to come out and form part of the vision. But I think, as I laid out earlier, we have these two paths, and we're wanting to see both informal and formal areas reaching a water-sensitive city with equity and equality as the end vision of this process. And then that will lead into an implementation strategy, which I'll touch on a bit more now. So our implementation strategy uses a bit of transition theory, and this is one of the examples of a framework out there where the issue emerges, it then gets defined, shared, knowledge dissemination, policy and practice, and then only embedded. And I think what's important, and I mentioned it early on, is that from issue emergence to knowledge, you don't make much ground. But without those, you can't get to policy practice and embedding the new practice. So the work that's been done by the WRC and UCT in terms of championing it, defining what water-sensitive cities and water-sensitive design is in South Africa, understanding some of the issues and trying to understand how you translate water sensitivity into the challenges and competing issues within South Africa, disseminating it. Platforms like this one are all critical in order to be able to get to the stage where it gets embedded into practice. Another transition framework looks at champions, platforms connecting knowledge, projects, applications, and tools and instruments. So as part of our implementation framework or assessing, we combine these two into a matrix like this, where you can look at champions, how that's, whether it's an emerging issue or there's good influential champions all the way up through the city. So for example, this project was put out by the Western Cape government and city in collaboration with relatively high level champions in both institutions. So cities doing, Cape Town's doing quite well in that. But what's useful in a framework like this is it highlights that there's not much point in having the world's best policy if you've only got one or two champions. They can write the best policy, but there'll be a disjuncture. And knowledge, you need to build that up in order to achieve, to move along in the water-sensitive cities direction. So we need projects like which were started in I think around 2009 with the South African urban drainage, sustainable urban drainage project, where the city of Cape Town and eThekwini and Joburg all did pilot projects or encouraged developers to start doing pilot projects. So that brings in your issues getting examined, your building up of your knowledge and helping that. So as part of our benchmarking, visioning, we'll also look into these frameworks and see where there are gaps and what needs to be developed further. And then as an output of that, there'll be guidance for the Western Cape. Hopefully that would be applicable to most of South Africa, but more granularity and tailoring of these guidelines for how you implement it in South Africa as opposed to Australia. But we're making quite a concerted effort to try and stick with the same 34 indicators, but just interpreting them for South Africa so that we can always compare back to other cities, both in South Africa, Indonesia, I think there have been some, Kirsty, and I think they're looking at it in India. So that we can translate across the world rather than just having our own indicator set. Just to touch on stakeholders, and I'll be finished soon. We have put in effort here where in Australia they would, for example, look largely at the municipal and utilities as their stakeholders. I think we recognize in South Africa that there is consultants have a large role to play with certain expertise, but they also mustn't dominate, as the same for NGOs and special purpose vehicles. So we've tried to balance it based on the sector and how much of that sector talks to or is involved in the provision of water services within the city. And you can see there's a lot of local, which is mainly the city of Cape Town, provincial, which has its responsibilities, national in South Africa has responsibilities, and then we've split it with NGOs, academia, and consultants, and tried to balance that out. And that's quite important. Otherwise, you get a maybe slightly skewed answer. Success factors, the range of internal and external audience or stakeholders that we engage early on. So as part of our strategy, especially within this COVID environment, we're having to adapt and try and engage people and get them interested and involved as soon as possible, building up to the workshop. And then just to touch on their involvement, you'll see that stakeholders are involved in every stage from inception. They what we decide at that point to benchmarking, they do the benchmarking. It's not benchmarking done by us. We provide information, facilitate, but we don't say, okay, well, we think it's a 3, so that's the rating, or this how we benchmark Cape Town. It's very much the participants, and that's all the stakeholders, and that's why they're so important that you get that choice right. And then vision and implementation, again, they set the vision and help with the implementation framework. And then communication goes through all the normal channels of leaflets, documents, online, digital, and with COVID, I think a lot more is online and digital than originally planned, but that's something I think we're all adjusting to at the moment. And that's a quick wrap of the project and what we're aiming to do. I don't know, Kirsty, if I left anything out from your side.
No, I don't think so. Thanks very much, Lloyd. That's helpful just to show what the sort of process is with this Water Sensitive Cities Index. It's worth noting that the CRC have done, I just wanted to check on the numbers here, but it's probably around 50 of these benchmarking processes around the world. Might be a little stretch. Most of them have been done in Australia, although they have worked in more than just Indonesia, actually. They've worked in Myanmar, China, Indonesia, Fiji, and they are trying to do some work in India. And of course now here in South Africa, which we're very excited about, because I think there is a lot of potential for this type of work to be expanded further within the South African space. And it's also, you know, the important concept here is that the intention towards water sensitive cities, which we're hoping is now spreading further and further around the country, needs to be matched with supportive policy, engaged stakeholders, particularly including the champions that Lloyd was talking about, funding, obviously, and capacity. You know, so these sorts of training environments are very important in terms of trying to push the process of water sensitive cities as much as we can. And then, of course, the index can be used once we've set it up for Cape Town, and it's all in the process of happening in the next couple of months. We're holding our first workshop next month. is that can be used as an advocacy tool and a sort of a knowledge sharing instrument for other processes around the country, which is really important. So thanks, Lloyd, very much. We're very excited about this project. We've been working on the whole notion of water sensitive cities here in South Africa for some time, and really keen to get our teeth stuck into what it means to have an implementation of a water sensitive city. And under no illusion that we're going to get there anytime very quickly, but we certainly at least have a good vision and a process to get us going with this. And I realize that many of you may not have even started with the lecture material yet, so this might be a little bit, feel a little strange at the moment because you haven't actually gone through all the lecture material or even read any of the essential readings. But as you do, keep reflecting on what you've heard today about this process of benchmarking and visioning, and think about how it fits into our planning and thinking about water sensitive cities. So we're going to open up to questions. I see there are a couple in the chat already. So let me go through the couple that are there, and then please raise your hands in the participant section and we can address your questions there. So Leila asks, what's a reasonable demand per capita per day, and do you think there's an underestimate of the actual usage occurring? That's an interesting question. So reasonable demand, at the moment, the average demand in South Africa is about 230, I think, litres per capita per day. It's around that. Clearly, when we went through the day zero crisis in Cape Town, we were all forced to come down to 50 litres per capita per day, although the real usage was probably closer to 80 or 90, I think, the actual usage.
About 90.
90, okay. What's reasonable? My feeling is that we should be approaching 100, 110, but it might be, you know, that might be a little on the small side for many places. We have to weigh up what is economically viable for a city, what is enough to make a city livable and productive and sustainable. So there certainly are countries in the world that limit it to around 110. Denmark is one, but of course they live in a very different environment to us. As far as an underestimate of the actual usage, I don't think there's an underestimate. What there is very, very large volumes of leakage and wastage. So our non-revenue water sits at an average of about 36%, I think, is the country average at the moment, which means that 36% of the water that's treated is not getting to its intended customers or used for its intended purposes. And I think that's where we are you know, maybe picking up this notion of underestimating, that we know how much we're using. There's a fairly good idea of what the daily demand is per capita. Lloyd, do you want to add in anything there?
I think the only thing maybe I can add is that there's also quite a inequality. So in Cape Town, there was a lot of, during day zero, a lot of, at one point, pictures of informal settlements with running taps. But even then and now, informal settlements are only using about 50 litres per capita per day with all that leakage, whereas some of the wealthier areas are using, say, 300 or 400 litres a day. So there's great inequality in water use, but on average, we're sitting at around, I think 230. And I think that needs to be addressed as we move to being a water-sensitive city, is that we need to provide more on the lower end or on the unserviced end and less to the other side.
Yeah. So Ernest is saying, from your experience in Cape Town, what were the main challenges with regard to the buy-in from the public and also the government? What is the probability of success that the approach can be applied in a different area in South Africa? Lloyd, do you want to comment on that first?
I can, but maybe going back to UCT days. I think the buy-in is to find the right champions and get them to take it up. So in Cape Town, at least with stormwater, there were two great champions who pushed the policy. and it made great strides between like 2009 and 2012 or so. And you need that sort of person there to really get it going. And as they changed their positions in the organization, they kept pushing it. And the same with, I think Jane will talk tomorrow. She's a great champion who's made a great impact in getting that spread. And whether it can be applied throughout South Africa, yeah, I think it can be applied, and I think it's more just the way you think about it and how you manage water. It's not that we don't have the skills or the capacity or the ability to do it. It's that we need those champions to spread the message and to start applying it and build those things that we're put in the implementation framework, so that we get the knowledge, we get the experience in South Africa, and do that more and more outside of just Cape Town, so that you can get the difference. Because Cape Town doesn't represent South Africa in terms of maybe geology or climate or any of those factors. But I think that slide where it showed the S curve is quite an important one, is that it takes time and then you can start making great leaps. And that's where Cape Town certainly is in some parts of South Africa, but the rest need that input.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I think there have been some really useful examples of this water sensitive design approach across South Africa, and we'll talk about some of those during the course next week during the 2 days. So eThekwini, for example, in Durban, has done some excellent work around sustainable drainage. Pretoria has put in place policies around SUDs as well, as has Johannesburg, in trying to drive development through a reconceptualized stormwater manual. So there's work done on redeveloping the Red Book, the design manual for engineers, so that it incorporates the water sensitive design and SUDS options. So there's certainly the probability of success is there. And Lloyd is absolutely right. As long as we have the right people and the right thinking in place in water management institutions around the country, then we will get there. I'm not sure if there are any blue hands.
Can I ask something, Christy?
Of course.
Hi, this is Suresh Rohila here. Lloyd, interesting presentation. And Christy, I'm the Senior Director at Center for Science and Environment. I was listening to your presentation, very interesting presentation. I wanted to know that what's the status of 24/7 water supply? Do the settlements have 24/7 water supply in South Africa? And how do you intend to address that issue in the water sensitive index? Whether you would like all the cities or settlements to first go 24/7 and then to be considered, which is more a centralized system, or just thoughts about that, because we have in India similar issues.
Yeah, so I think by and large, South Africa has 24/7 supply. There are some challenges here and there that don't. In terms of the index, I think it does need to be contextualized per country, and I think some of your challenges around intermittent supply would be a bit different to ours. But the index in water sensitive cities particularly talks to having enough water of the right quality. So it's about supply of enough potable water, so people aren't living on, say, 20 liters a day or being supplied with non-potable water. And I think that's why it's important that the sort of benchmarking process does get contextualized a bit, because we don't necessarily have the same issues.
One of the interesting things would be that water sensitive design as a practice would say that non-potable water requirements could be met through alternative sources, not through the piped waters.
Yeah.
How would we, that would be, I would like to see that how the index addresses that. The Australians do have a very interesting experience on that, but in some of these places where the areas may not be connected on the pipe networks, they may never be on the pipe network, but they may go decentralized on many aspects.
So part of the index doesn't try and push either centralized or decentralized approaches. Ideally, there's a combination where possible, but if decentralized is the option for a small community, it's about the outcome. Do they have access to the water? Is it of adequate quality for what they need? And do they have fit for purpose use? So if you're going to harvest stormwater and rainwater, what is that used for? Is it adequate? Is there enough to drink? Yes. Then you can still rate relatively, then get your rating as a water supply city. But if you're supplying water that's substandard, even if you're doing it 24 hours a day, you're not going to be a water supply city.
Sure. Thank you very much.
Any other questions? I guess a lot of this will become clearer as we progress through the training. I mean, the one thing that I'm quite interested in as part of this process is the systems analysis, actually, part of looking at the benchmarking, you know, so to really get a good understanding of each town and city in terms of what's happening with their water systems, how are they being managed, what is the demand, what is the non-revenue water rate, whether they have this 24/7 supply, whether they are able to move into decentralized systems, what the alternative sources are, all of this sort of thing, plus the supportive social and environmental aspects that would drive the water sensitive city thinking. And it's that the systems analysis becomes really important. And it does make me wonder whether the smaller towns and maybe some of the less well-resourced towns in the country will be able to do this type of systems thinking, whether they'll be able to gather the data and the information that is required to make the decisions and really think about the indicators, the choices that we will put down for a water-sensitive city. So I wondered if anyone is perhaps coming from a smaller town that would have any thoughts on that, or any inputs on what you think would be the processes around gathering the type of information. We can certainly talk about this some during the course as well.
Catherine raised her hand, so if you can unmute yourself and ask your question. Catherine Bill, she raised her hand.
Oh, Catherine.
Yes, hi, thank you very much. It's actually not in response to what you just said now, Kirsty, but I was just thinking when we looked at the methodology of going through the workshops and getting the stakeholder input, how important is it to have the factual information as opposed to people's impressions? You know, I'm thinking in a country like ours where there is a lot of inequality in service. Some people, as you said, might, or I think Lloyd said, some experience, you know, flooding and others don't, and we can come up with a sort of average score, which kind of means nothing if if you're trying to, as Lloyd said, maybe we have to have two ways to assess the city as sort of two separate areas where there's informal and formal. But I just wondered, you know, how much one must be really precise and scientific about that to get an accurate idea of also what the potential is for water sensitive interventions. Because I'm also thinking in terms of informal settlements, you know, how can one actually develop interventions when land is at a premium and it's often invaded because people want to be closer to potential job opportunities and so on? Because to me that is a huge challenge in our context and probably in a lot of other countries too.
Lloyd, do you want to try and start that, or?
I can start. I think in terms of the precise thing, it's been one of the aspects that we've spent probably the most, the most time on with the CRC, trying to work out how we account for this almost two cities in one, and how you do it. Because even if you had to ask me, and I've spent the last 2 years almost purely working on City of Cape Town's water supply, I can't weight it in my head how much is formal, informal, semi-formal. It's quite difficult. And I don't think many stakeholders could, because you're biased by your experiences and your perceptions and what you read in the newspaper and how you experienced day zero. So there is a need to try and be precise and guide it. So a lot of the systems analysis is fed to the participants in terms of, this is what the facts are, now discuss. And then if someone brings something up, we prepare all those facts. So if they present something, we can say, no, but these are the facts for it. Not to say, no, you must rate it a number 2 or you must rate it as perfect. These are the facts. And our thinking at the moment is, in terms of applying it with the informal and formal, is to do the weighting, do an informal, a formal, completely independent, and then do a weighting together. But within that weighting, each of the indices or have certain hurdles you have to pass. So even once we've weighted it, we'll then go and look at whether, if you land, say, a score of 3 as your weighted score, but you didn't achieve the hurdles in 2, then we'd take the city back, because that talks to things like 80% of your population has a certain standard, or 90% has a certain standard. So it is going to get a bit complicated, but I think facts are important, and it's part of the preparation for the workshop and your facilitators need to be on the ball. So we have a lot of background work that needs to be done to be ready to answer any left field questions that come up, and answer them with fact, not our feelings or perceptions or views. I can't remember the second part of the question. It was slightly...
I was just saying about the space issues. If land is invaded for housing, how does one actually implement these detention ponds and so on? And I mean, even wetlands are infilled. How do you actually protect that from people who desperately need somewhere to live?
I think in the original guidelines, it was stated as the wicked problem, the perfect definition of a wicked problem, where there are many challenges but no solutions. I think that's some of what we need to look at as part of this, but it's not an easy question to answer. And I think there's lots of talk of leapfrogging and getting through. But in order to leapfrog, we need to know that the technology works. We can't be testing technology on South Africa's poor or previously disadvantaged. That would be wrong. So that's why that development of knowledge is pretty critical, that it happens and happens quickly. Then we can start applying it. And it's also about engagement with people and maybe a certain level of education. So after the drought, I think I saw some photos from this last week where I think this year we're going to hit about average rainfall, and there are huge areas of new informal settlements flooded. And that's a problem. That's probably partly what you're bringing up. And that needs to be addressed partly, I guess, through education, that these areas you can't move into, but also trying to get ahead of them. And that requires resources, and as we know, we quite constrained on that. So yeah, perfect wicked problem.
Right. One question I had, though we are also the organizers of this meeting, but it was an interesting thing because I can officially say that today we have also partnered with CRC. Officially, we have inked our partnership with them. But very interesting, contextualization is important in a sense that, for example, India would, and I'm sure in South Africa would also be similar context, some things, is that we have a relationship of culture and water, or there is a historicity of water management where settlements were sensitive to water. So whether we would be leaving them out and say they were not sensitive, and the most modern technological cities, we are going to rank them better and say that these are going to be said that these are sensitive plant features. For example, in India, we would find some tanks, temple tanks, we call it. In southern India, you would find there are a lot of temples and there are tanks, water tanks. But with development, what happens is these tanks get replaced or filled up, and the role of community and role of cultural linkages with the water as a integral part of society gets replaced by bureaucracy and technocratic systems. So it would be good to see that in global South in particular, and I see South Africa as a mix of global, modern and the kind of context we will see. So I would love to follow up and see how you contextualize your, index. Certainly in India, we have a very big issue. That's why when I was developing as a Center for Excellence for doing the reform agenda for Government of India, we said we are not doing an index. We said we are developing a framework. And that framework would vary from city to city or region to region. Maybe for a big city, maybe this kind of a very sophisticated. So this I wanted to know your take on this, whether it would be similar in the case of South Africa. Whether culture, communities' role in the past, heritage.
Yeah, it is, I think, very important, and an interesting question, because the CRC index has a specific indice for what they in Australia call indigenous knowledge. And at first, when we were going through them, I was like, does indigenous knowledge get taken into account in South African design and practice? And to a certain degree, maybe not. We do also have historically replaced with municipal supply connected to a network. But increasingly, I think a lot of the things like rainwater tanks are coming back. There are options for that. And yeah, maybe you also touch on something else, that water-sensitive design is not necessarily completely new. A lot of the solutions are actually quite old or go back to the days when people were on farms. I mean, soakaways, we used them for sanitation hundreds of years ago. It's not necessarily a new technology. It's how it's applied maybe now in higher density settlements might be different, and we need to fine tune it. But you don't need to be a Melbourne to be water sensitive, and you don't need to structure your water supply like that. It's got to be context appropriate, and in the same way you need to interpret those indices context appropriate. But indigenous knowledge or local knowledge, or however you wish to phrase it, I think that's actually becoming more important. And on a number of projects I've recently worked relating to flooding, it's been one of those things that has tripped you up, is people have come through and said, well, this is the history, why are you not considering it? And I think a thing like this benchmarking and bringing that indice in particular up is going to be a bit of a left field question to many. Well, why? We've got great dams, why? But when you spend a bit of time reflecting on it, it highlights how much we're possibly missing out on, how much better we could do things if we maybe considered a couple other options as well.
And I think this brings also into play the discussion around what happens in the informal settlements, for example, because so much of that, and come back to what Catherine was raising, how do we think about appropriate options in informal settlements where we may not be able to do what we think of as conventional water sensitive design? It could still operate in that same field. I did see a couple of hands, and I think one is, or have they all? Hildegard, did you want to say something?
Let me just unmute. All right. I actually just wanted to respond to the previous question about the informal settlements, because from our experience during the WSC project, we really found that there's no blueprint solution for two different areas. And we looked at neighboring municipalities in terms of its urban planning and the water sensitive planning that we're trying to implement. But even if it's geographically neighboring areas, the rainfall, the geology, the population, the usage, basically the culture, everything differed. It was extremely different from one another. But I think we as practitioners should start asking the water sensitive questions. I mean, what is our role as urban planners in terms of how can we implement water sensitivity within our practice? And then based on that, hopefully we can achieve the entire cycle where we become water sensitive. But informal settlements and formal areas, they differ completely. And we've been dealing with that for quite some time. And it's different challenges, different communication levels. It's a challenge on its own, but it's interesting. Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, I think we've more or less come. Odwa Badi, did you want to say something?
Yes, I want to ask a question and sort of put a comment, but I see our time is almost up now. So I'll be quick. Thank you for the presentation. It was very informative. I just want to ask in terms of the stakeholder engagement and the education that you did in Cape Town, as in for that stakeholder engagement, how much time period do you allow for that? And why I ask that specifically, now I'm sending it to the rural areas. The rural areas where people don't understand anything about engineering. They might know water in terms of layman terms, so that might need extra effort to educate them in terms of the water sensitive design issues. Then secondly, also, which came out in the Auditor General's report, which found only 74 or 76 of our South African municipalities out of the 200 have technical people or engineers in them. How then are we going to be able, I would say, getting those municipalities in order to inform people about this water sensitive design? Yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
If I can respond maybe to the second one first. Yes, the technical challenges are quite significant in terms of municipalities without adequate technical staff, and I think it is something that's been highlighted by Auditor General, the South African Institute of Civil Engineering. They've all highlighted it. I guess there are two ways of looking at it. Firstly, if you look at our stakeholder groups, we are including consultants in, which they wouldn't do in Australia, because we recognize that consultants do a lot of that work. Secondly, and there is no making up for technical skills. It's something that needs to be addressed in municipalities in South Africa and will come out in this implementation and framework implementation plan, that is critical. But also, we don't, and maybe this might be controversial, so it's my own opinion, we don't need to necessarily always have the most technological solution. And I think a lot of water sensitive design, we're talking about, to use the Australian phrase, indigenous knowledge, we're talking about experience. People might not know the engineering of it, but they know water. Everyone deals with water on a daily basis. And there are solutions that don't necessarily need to be the most sophisticated that we could put in, that we can manage. And I think that's important, that we use technology that is appropriate in the context. Yeah, I think that's important. And then I've just gone blank on the first question, since I jumped to the second one.
Rural areas.
Our stakeholder engagement, it's going now, but the people used for the stakeholder engagement are largely your, it's that municipality, national, provincial, and some stakeholders from the community. So it's about a month process to benchmarking. It could, I agree, if it's in a rural area and it's a new concept that you're taking there, it might take longer. But that's also, again, going back to that implementation framework, why it's important to have champions so the message starts getting out there. There's no point in just trying to overnight say, okay, we're all going water sensitive cities. You do need that momentum. You do need that understanding to be there. So I guess, in all honesty, the stakeholder engagement for Cape Town probably started in 2013 with those initial projects, and Kirsty and Neil at UCT engaging with the city stormwater department and water supply. So I think that S-curve is, again, important. You don't maybe feel like you're making much progress. And I think that was a nice thing that came out for me from our training with the CRC was you might not feel like you're making progress, but you're doing some of the most critical work. And that you need to, forums like this are critical to getting that message out there and experience.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I think we probably, well, we are over time, so I will leave it up to Shivali to finish up for us.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Dr. Kirsty and Dr. Lloyd, for giving us this informative session and sharing your experiences. And I think we had a very good discussion today in the webinar. I would request all the participants to also post queries in discussion forum in the points of view of the question. So that's all for now, and let's meet tomorrow, same time here. We'll have another good session, and see you for today. Bye.
Right.
Thank you, Lloyd. Thank you, Christy.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you tomorrow.
Bye-bye. See you tomorrow, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
People. Bye.